started. Today's speaker is Professor Nicole Riemer from the University of Illinois. For those of you who don't know Nicole, she was here as an assistant professor years ago. She showed up in 2002. We hired her. We were very happy.
2005.
Oh, 2005?
Yeah.
2007, sorry. 2005 to 2007, and then sadly we watched her go away. Didn't want that to happen, but
that's what husbands do.
Two-body problem. So, we're very happy to have her back to visit us. She's been back and forth a few times since 2007. So actually you were here for 3 years because you showed up in March of 2005 and you didn't leave till December 2007.
Right.
And technically more than 2.5. So I'm rounding up. 3 years
all right.
almost. And we really enjoy working with Nicole, and it's great having her here. Some of us still get to work with her, even though she's flat. It's flat.
It is flat. No doubt about that. You got that one right.
Yeah, so thanks. So anyway, Nicole is a modeler, right?
Right.
Not experimental.
No, not.
And she's, I really like Nicole's approach because she digs into how models work and she's very aware of models' shortcomings, I feel, and is able to use them as a diagnostic. In particular, this is important for what she does, which is really, represent the role of aerosol in climate models and chemistry models, which is an extremely difficult thing to do. Not the least of which is because there's so many uncertainties associated with aerosol from an experimental perspective as well, and trying to incorporate what we know in that body of knowledge into a model is challenging. You really got to understand what the limitations are of both sets of information you're working with, experimental and theoretical. So that's what she's going to talk about today. The boring stuff. Nicole got her PhD equivalent at Karlsruhe, and then she came over here basically to Davis. You were at Davis for a little while before you came here, but she's been very productive and prolific at Illinois. We're very happy to see her progress and become a real leader in the field since in the past, I don't know, gosh, she's been gone for 7 years already, 7.5 years. You look the same. You look great. So anyway, Nicole Riemer.
All right. Thanks for a nice introduction. So I'm really glad to be back here. I already had a really nice morning, and I'm looking forward to the afternoon, the evening, and some part of tomorrow. Today I would like to show you some things that we are doing in my group, and the title became a little bit long, ParticleResolved Modeling to Quantify Aerosol Mixing State Impact on Climate. But the focus really should be to convey the message, what are particle-resolved models? What can they be applied for? How can they offer insight that has not been able to be provided so far with the traditional aerosol models? And how should we think about this thing, aerosol mixing state? And before I get to this, I actually want to show you a little animation, a little movie. Let's see. So some of you might be familiar with this animation. It came out a couple of years ago. It's done by scientists at NASA. And I really love this movie. It shows the global burden of aerosols. And the colors are actually aerosol optical depth. So the amount of extinction of sunlight that is accomplished by aerosol particles. So the more intensive the colors are, the more extinction you have. And they have colored this aerosol burden by aerosol type. And so what is remarkable about the simulation is it's a global simulation at a 10-kilometer resolution, so really, really high resolution. And you can see really nicely the interaction of the aerosols with the global circulation. And so if we focus for a moment here on the reddish color, so obviously this is mineral dust, and you can see how mineral dust is transported from the Sahara over the Atlantic to the Americas, interacting with these easterly waves here. You can see the sea salt. Sea salt is brought into the atmosphere by the wind, and so the higher the wind speed is, the more sea salt you can have in the atmosphere. So you see the highest burden in the southerly ocean and here in the storm track. Another type of aerosol are these biomass burning aerosols, and you see a lot of activity here in Central Africa. and in the Amazon, and also here over in Indonesia, where people burn biomass. And the last type are the so-called sulfates, and you can see a lot of sulfate burden here over where we have most of pollution. So that's North America, Europe, and a lot of it also in Asia. So that stands quite out. And some of this pollution is obviously transported to the US, and from the US it goes to Europe, and from Europe it goes to the east. So we are living on a globe after all. There's another white spot right here, and there's one coming up here. So what do you think that is? It's louder?
Volcano?
It's a volcano, exactly. So volcanoes also make sulfate, and you saw here this impressive eruption off the coast of Madagascar, where the sulfate are dispersed over quite a wide area. Okay.
There doesn't seem to be much over Australia. I thought there would be more in the deserts.
Yeah, over Australia we see a little bit of the red stuff, right? So that's the dust. And so a little bit of pollution here in the East Coast, right, where most of the cities are. Not much on the West Coast, where my husband is coming from. So, yeah, so that's just that. Okay, so the reason why I showed you this animation is because I wanted to ask you, after seeing that movie, if I ask you what is the conceptual model of aerosol particles that you take away from such a movie, you probably come up with something like this. So we have our different types of aerosols, the dust, the sea salt, the smoke, the sulfates, and we know the particles have a certain size distribution, so size is important, obviously, so we might assign different sizes to these particles, but essentially there are these different types. They are happily being transported separately from each other as different traces. And so that's what we call, this is an external mixture of different aerosol types, right? And from a modeling point of view, this is a nice thing because it's pretty clean. We only need to add 1, 2, 3, 4 different traces to our model, and forward we go in time. Now, if I ask my friends who do microscopy analysis of aerosol particles, they show me pictures like this, right? So these are real particles in the ambient atmosphere, and the one thing that stands out immediately is there is almost no particle that is just a single substance, right? So each individual aerosol particle that you see here, and there are only 6, but they are mixtures of different components, right? So this one here is ammonium sulfate, some organics, and fly ash, all mixed into one particle. Here we have ammonium sulfate, dust, and soot, all mixed in one particle. And they have crazy shapes too, so that's another thing to consider. And so then what it appears to be the fact, so instead of thinking of these clean external mixtures, if we think about aerosol particles, more appropriate would be maybe something like this, right? So where individual particles are mixtures of different chemical components. And that obviously reflects the history of the aerosol particles in the atmosphere, right? So you might have a dust particle that is emitted from a desert, but on its way it encounters a lot of processes throughout the atmosphere. So it might, there might be condensable vapors condensing on the aerosol, on this dust particle, forming a mixed dust and organic particle. Or a particle might collide with another particle, forming a mixed particle. So instead of having these clean, nice external mixtures, we have more something like this. So the particles are, some are still more or less pure, but others are internally mixed of different components. And from a modeling point of view, this is a nightmare, right? So suddenly we have particles that look all different from each other. How do we cope with this? And does it even matter, right? So how much error do we commit if we assume that the aerosol population looks like this? If we think about the impacts of aerosol on climate and health. So one particle type that we have been focusing on a lot is black carbon in the atmosphere. So black carbon is an interesting type of aerosol because it absorbs radiation. So it causes a warming of the atmosphere where this aerosol type exists. And freshly emitted diesel soot particles that mostly black carbon look like this. So they are these fractal agglomerate. But over time, as these particles are exposed to the processes in the atmosphere that I mentioned already, coagulation and condensation, which are summarized by this term aging, right? So we call this the aerosol aging. That composition can change, and so after some time, you see this soot particle now embedded in some coated composite particle. So this would be a freshly emitted diesel soot particle, and over here, diesel soot is aged. So it has a coating of sulfate in this case. And so for climate impacts of aerosols, this is relevant because a freshly emitted soot particle doesn't really like to become a cloud condensation nucleus. It's rather hydrophobic. After some time of aging and after acquiring these soluble coatings, this aged particle actually can become a cloud condensation or can become a cloud droplet very easily, right? Because the sulfate takes up water very easily. And so the hygroscopic properties change, and also the optical properties change. So I already mentioned diesel soot is absorbing, and it turns out by giving the soot particle a shell or a coating of non-absorbing substances, the absorption goes even up. So the soot is absorbing even more per mass unit of black carbon than it would absorb if it was uncoated. So this aging process really changes both the optical properties and the hygroscopicity. So the climate impacts that we are interested in quantifying are both changed on a per particle level. And the big question obviously is, are these details important? So if we think about health impacts also, if we think about the direct impact of aerosols on climate, so the direct interaction of aerosols with solar radiation, and if we think about the interaction of aerosol particles with clouds. So there is actually quite a big body of literature in a body of literature exists that looks at this question, because people are obviously aware these details matter, and so what they have been trying is to do sensitivity studies where the potential impacts of this mixing state representations are addressed. And so this is a study by Serena Chung and John Seinfeld from now 10 years ago, where they conducted global modeling simulations, and they assigned different mixing states to black carbon. So in the top picture you see, they assume the black carbon to be externally mixed, so it doesn't contain any coatings, as they calculate optical properties for black carbon. And in the bottom figure, they assume that black carbon is internally mixed with sulfate. And so this is just showing the annual mean surface temperature. You get quite different answers, right? So if you assume an internal mixture, you get a much larger change in the equilibrium annual mean surface temperature compared to if you assume this external mixture. And so what they didn't do is to represent the transformation of black carbon as it goes from the external mixture into the internal mixture. So they assume just one state here and a different configuration at the bottom, and we're assessing what is sensitivity. And so the conclusion of this paper is that the mixing state of black carbon with other aerosols is important in determining its climate effect. And so now I'm coming to the point where I want to explain how we can create a model that actually can account for these differences in particle composition on a per particle level. And so the way we think of aerosol particles are as these high-dimensional vectors. And so the dimensionality comes into play if we think of the chemical species of the aerosol population as the different dimensions, right? And so here, for simplicity, I'm showing a three-dimensional space, right? So we have three different species: black carbon, sulfate, and organic carbon. So in reality, we have many, many more species. In our model, we have about 20. In the real atmosphere, if we think about all the different organics that we might have, that number would be even higher, right? And so here we have the little aerosol population consisting of 3 particles. The first particle contains a little bit of black carbon, quite a bit of sulfate, and intermediate amount of organic carbon. And then we have a different particle that has a different composition, and a third particle that is different yet again, right? So our particles live in this 3-dimensional space, and the aerosol processes that now act on this population move those particles around in this space. So you might have, for example, you might have condensation of sulfate on this population. This would move all the particles to the right, right? Or you might have 2 particles coagulate with each other. So for example, the blue with the red forms a new particle. So we would place that new particle according to its new composition in that space. And so you could think of each of these particles as a vector, right? And so each amount of your chemical species is an entry in these individual vectors. And then we can formulate the governing equations that characterize our aerosol population. So we have one for the particle concentration density. So that's this little n of, and it depends on the composition vector mu and on time. And so the equation for that would be how this changes with time. It changes due to coagulation. So these are the coagulation terms here. It changes due to condensation. So we have the coupling to the gas phase. So gases can condense on the particles and change this density function. And we can have changes due to emission, and actually dilution could be incorporated in this term also. And then coupled to this, we have the vector for our gas phase species, and the gas phase species undergo chemical reactions. That would be the first term. And again, this is the coupling term to the aerosol phase. So we have some gas phase species condensing on the aerosol particles. Okay, so if we believe that these are the equations that we want to represent in our model, now we have to discretize this, right? And so what are the options? So here, this is a representation of the true function of our particle density. So the typical or the traditional approaches now are either to apply a finite volume method, where we chop everything up into individual bins, or we impose certain modes, so these distribution functions to resolve it. And so that is fine if we have a low-dimensional problem, right? So if we only care about black carbon particles or sulfate particles or dust particles, we can do something like this. Even if we were looking at maybe a combination of sulfate and black carbon, right? Like a 2-dimensional population, this would be exactly that picture. One axis is sulfate, the other axis is black carbon, and so the height here shows how much particles you have at the given combination. We can do this. If we go to 3 dimension, you get a lot of bins here, right? You can see this already. And if we go to anything more than 3, this becomes quickly infeasible, right? Because you wind up with way too many bins to track. And so what we are doing instead, so if you are familiar with aerosol modeling or cloud droplet modeling, what we do is we choose radius. We collapse this whole multidimensional distribution, right? So we choose radius as 1 dimension because we know particle size is really important. And then we have our individual bins here or our individual modes. And the crucial assumption is within one size bin or within one mode, all the particles look the same, right? And so that is this so-called internally mixture assumption. And so if we, for example, emit particles at a certain size range, they would be instantly averaged with the already existing particles in those size bins. So we lose the individuality of our particles and the average within a certain size range. So we potentially lose a lot of information. And so instead of using now these finite volumes or these modal methods that have been applied in the past, what we are doing is we resolve individual particles. So this now becomes a stochastic method where we sample our multidimensional space with individual computational particles. And so instead of having these bins or modes with this internal mixture assumption, we literally resolve individual aerosol particles where we track the composition according to this equation, mimicking particles moving around in this multidimensional space. Okay, so this is what particle-resolved models do. And so then, just to summarize or formalize this a little bit, so we started out with our continuous distribution function n of this composition vector mu. So we put our discrete particles over this population. And the aerosol processes, I mentioned that already, they are treated stochastically. So we sample the population for coagulation events, emission, dilution, nucleation. So that's done with the model part that is called part MC. But on each particle, we also perform chemistry. And that is done deterministically, like all models do. We use the chemistry model Mosaic, which was developed by our collaborators at PNNL. So on each particle, we calculate how much secondary aerosol is forming. Is this aerosol going to be solid or liquid? Things like this. Okay, so now that I explained the model framework somewhat, I want to show you what typical applications look like. So this whole thing started out as a box model, as you can imagine. So we have an air parcel with a certain background concentration of aerosol particles, which we resolve with individual computational particles. This parcel is being advected over an industrialized area. It picks up all kinds of particle emissions, gas phase emissions. There's chemistry going on. Secondary aerosol is forming on the primarily emitted particles. So the particles age, right? And so we know everything about those particles in this volume. And then that parcel might leave that industrialized area, and there's still aerosol aging going on with the remaining chemical components in this volume. And so we can look at this process over, let's say, a day or two. That would be our typical setup. And so how do we display our results? Well, obviously, we can reconstruct the bulk concentration of the aerosol just like any other model. So we can look at total nitrate, total ammonium, sulfate, black carbon. So this is just showing one example of one of these urban plume scenarios. We can take so literally our output is a long list of our particle vectors that store all the composition of our particles, right? And so per simulation, we look at about 100,000 or million particles, and then we can bin them by size and look at these size distributions, which is a very straightforward thing to do, right? But the really unique aspect of our simulations is this information, right? So what we often would do is we would project our multidimensional distribution onto these two dimensions. So we work out what is the dry diameter of each particle and what is the black carbon mass fraction. So we are very interested in black carbon, right? How black carbon is aging. And then we construct these 2D histograms, right? So the color is shows you how many particles you have at a given size with a given black carbon mass fraction. And this is just one snapshot. After a few hours of aging, you see some particles have a rather high black carbon mass fraction, others don't. And so if you look at a given size, 0.1 micron, for example, there's this whole range of black carbon mass fraction. And in conventional aerosol models, this axis here would be collapsed down, right? So we only would know the average. Okay, so the benefits of a detailed aerosol model like this is, well, obviously we make no approximation regarding mixing state. So whenever you think mixing state might be important, that is a good approach. And so we have been using this type of model for three main applications. One is as a coarse graining tool. So what does this mean? We are using it to derive parameters for more approximate models. More approximate models meaning regional scale models, global scale models that can't track all the detail, right? So for example, I will show a brief example where we extracted the aging timescale of black carbon. That's a topic that I've been working on since my PhD, right? Pretty much. Another application, obviously, is since we are resolving mixing state, we can use it as a benchmark and for error quantification for those more approximate models that are used in larger scale application. And so there's a whole number of them where we have done this in the past. And of course, we can do detailed studies on the particle scale and, for example, compare with chamber experiments. We've done that too. I won't have time to show an example, so we can talk about this after the talk if you're interested. After the benefits, I want to point out the limitations as well. One of them is obviously resolution. We only have a finite number of computational particles per grid cell, typically on the order of 10,000 to maybe 10 to the 7. And if you look at this, this is again one of these 2D histograms. On the edges, it becomes noisy, right? So this is because we are running out of computational particles. This has been improved by a lot of algorithmic development. So initially what we did, we really equated one computational particle with one real particle. So that gets you into trouble because if you have a population where you have lots of, let's say, small, freshly nucleated sulfate particles and a few coarse mode particles, you will lose resolution in the coarse mode, sorry. With these weighted particles, this has been greatly improved. So now we are able to adaptively zoom into certain parts of the population. And the sampling algorithms is also a constant area where we can make improvement. This code also runs very well in parallel. So what we do is we distribute the particles over different processors. That's another way where we can make use of the supercomputers these days and make things go fast. Okay, so one application next where we used this ParticleResolved Modeling as a coarse graining tool. And back to this aerosol aging problem, right? So how quickly does black carbon change from this state into an age state, and along with this goes changes in the physical chemical properties. So global models really would like to capture this because this determines, amongst other things, how quickly black carbon is scavenged from the atmosphere, right? So if it's in this configuration or if it's aged, so if black carbon has coatings of more soluble substances, it can be incorporated into clouds, it can be removed from the atmosphere. And so if black carbon reaches the Arctic or not, for example, can depend on that. And so global models do this by applying an aging time scale between a hydrophobic population, so that would be the fresh population, and a hydrophilic or an aged population of black carbon, right? And so the first time this was applied, to my knowledge, was in 1996 by Cook and Wilson. And so they applied an aging timescale of 1.6 days. That number has changed a little bit, but it's roughly about a day. And as you can imagine, there's little field or lab data to support these numbers. And you can also imagine, since I was talking about the processes that accomplish this change, it's probably not such a great assumption to choose one fixed number for the whole globe. It should depend on the conditions, right? And so that's how we came up with a aging criterion that is based on CCN activity. And so for this, I wanted to show you this kind of graph. So again, size of the particles is on the x-axis. On the y-axis now we have critical supersaturation. So what we do for each particle, we know its size and composition, and we know the critical supersaturation of a particle depends on those two things, right? So size and composition, you can work out what supersaturation in the cloud do I need in order to make a cloud droplet out of this particular particle. So we calculate this for each of our 10,000, 100,000 million particles in our population, and then we can graph it in a 2D histogram like this. So the color indicates, again, the number concentration. For a fresh population, just after the start of the simulation, it might look like this. So you see we have two subpopulations here. One that is quite hydrophobic, so we have at a given size really high critical supersaturations that would render them a cloud droplet. So these are our freshly emitted combustion particles. And then this other population are more hygroscopic background particles. So again, given one size, we have quite a different or heterogeneous population with very hygroscopic and very hydrophobic particles. After some hours of aging in this plume, the picture changed, right? So you see this maximum here now. This line is 0.3% supersaturation, just as an example. Most of them have moved below that, which would mean those are considered now as aged, and then there are still some fresh particles. Okay, so what we have to do is we have to define our threshold supersaturation. In our case now, this is 0.3%, right? And then we can identify which particles are fresh and which particles are aged in our plume. And we can also, at each time step, if we compare two adjacent time steps, we can determine the particles that make the transition due to condensation or coagulation, right? We can check time t0, time t0 plus delta t, how much made the transition across this line. So we know this number, we know how many fresh ones we have, so we can work out what is the aging time scale diagnostically. And that's what a time series diurnal cycle of this aging time scale might look like for one scenario, right? So just focus on this blue line for now. You see during the daytime, the aging time scale is actually quite short, which means the transition from hydrophobic to hydrophilic goes within an hour, right? During the nighttime, aging time scale is much longer. And so that is because of, again, it comes down to the processes. During the day, we have a lot of condensation of these secondary aerosol species on our population, making them more hygroscopic. During the night, we don't produce those vapors that can condense because there is no sunlight. And so then we have much slower aging that is dominated by coagulation. Coagulation is usually in the atmosphere not that quick. So that was just one example from one of our urban plume runs. So my student Laura did this for many, many runs, going through all kinds of different conditions, trying to create different environments that you might encounter as you go around the globe. And it's just showing the range of species that we covered, trying to map out or being consistent with what is actually observed in different environments. And so what she found is a distribution of aging timescales. And so one obvious thing is it depends on what supersaturation threshold you choose, right? So here are 3 examples. 0.1, which means a pretty mellow cloud that doesn't produce much supersaturation. The aging timescales are longest. If you have a more vigorous cloud, supersaturation threshold of 1%, maybe the aging timescales are much shorter. So this is 1 hour, 1 day, 1 week. And so this is the frequency distribution taking into account, I believe, 300 scenarios. And so the question we were wondering is, given that we get this distribution, right, so what are the key drivers for this aging of black carbon? And so what Laura did was she performed a non-parametric regression to identify the variables that best explain the aging timescales, with the background of trying to come up with variables that global models know, right? So we are doing a whole bunch of detailed simulations, and now we are zooming out and trying to learn something that can be applied to larger scale models. And so she had this whole list of candidates that might explain, or that might be key drivers for aging, and she tried different combinations. Some of these variables are on a population level, others are on a particle level. And in the end, what came out, so it was actually advantageous to split up this aging timescale in a aging due to coagulation and aging due to condensation. So our main aging processes, separate them out. And then Laura was able to explain 90% of the variance in the coagulation timescale by the number concentration of large and CCN active particles. So that makes sense. If you have a lot of large particles that are already CCN active in your population, the black carbon particles can age very quickly, right, if they coagulate with those. And it also depends on the size of the fresh particles, because the size of the fresh particles determines how quickly you get coagulation between those large guys. And then for the condensation timescale, most of the variance is explained by these three things: how much secondary aerosol flux you produce, what the hygroscopicity is of that condensing material, and again the size of the fresh particles. And so then the result of this non-parametric regression are these surfaces here. So coagulation timescale depends on these two things: number, concentration of large CCN, and the diameter of the particles that are aging, so our black carbon particles. So if you look at a certain concentration of large CCN, 2000 for example here, as the diameter of the black carbon particles becomes larger, the aging timescale increases, right? Because coagulation is most efficient between really small particles and large particles. For the condensation aging timescale, if the particles start out being small, it takes a very long time for them to age by condensation, right? It's much more likely that they age by coagulation. If they are above a certain size threshold, then the aging by condensation can actually go pretty quick, and it depends somewhat on the material that ages them. So that's this kappa parameter that quantifies the hygroscopicity. Okay, so that would be one example where we used a particle-resolved model to come up with parameters for a more approximate model, in this time the aging timescale. And we are now working with global modelers to implement this on a global scale to improve their aging parameterization. The second example that I wanted to show you is more about this error quantification question. How do we quantify how important mixing state really is? Do we need to worry about all these different compositions, or are there maybe areas on the globe where we are safe, where we can actually use our traditional models, which are much faster, and just be fine with it in predicting climate relevant properties? And now I want to become a little bit more precise what I actually mean by mixing state, because depending on who you talk to, you might have quite different preconceptions what this might be. And so, to my understanding, there are these two ways you can look at mixing state. And I actually only talk about the first one, acknowledging that the second one might be even more exciting. So the first one I would call the population mixing state. And so that's simply how the particles are, or how the chemical compounds are distributed across the particle population. So take this example. We have a population of 6 square particles, right? And in this case, we have, or in both cases, we have the same amount of orange, blue, and green. But the different components, the orange component, the blue, and the green component, they are distributed very differently over the population, right? So here, each particle is pure, so that's our external mixture. And here, each particle contains all 3 species to the same amount. So that's what we would call a perfect internal mixture, right? Distribution of chemical compounds across the particle population. From now on, I will only talk about that aspect, but then there is another level, right? We could think about, if we have these mixtures, how are the different components actually distributed within a particle? And so if you look back to, I won't pull up that slide now, that microscopy picture, that could actually be very relevant and very interesting. But for now, we won't look at this any further. Okay, so in reality, you will probably not find something that is either this or that, but you look at something in between, right? Maybe something that looks like this. And so in Quantify mixing state, since we are dealing with mixing state a lot, it really came out, or we really would have liked a metric for mixing state, right? Can we put a number on this population that tells us the mixing state of this population is whatever, some number, and here it's a different number, right? And if you look at these different populations, 2 factors emerge. So this metric needs to include, on the one hand, how complex the particles are by itself. So these ones are much more complex than these, right? Because each of those contains 3 species as compared to just one. But all of these particles, and that's the second aspect, they look the same from each other, right? They are all identical, versus here, they are all different. No, some of them are different. Here, all of them are actually different. So what you will see in a second, it's actually 2 numbers that characterize mixing state. One that pertains to the complexity of the particles, and the other one, how different the particles are from each other. And it turns out there is another scientific community that had the exact same problem, and that is the field of ecology. And so they talk about this problem in the context of species diversity. So they look at a certain ecosystem, and they look at what species live within that ecosystem on different water holes in this case, right? And so you could have like an ecosystem where the water holes look like this. One water hole is inhabited just by elephants, the other one by zebras, and the third one by buffaloes, right? So this would be externally mixed water holes versus internally mixed water holes, where you have each water hole being inhabited by a number of different species. And in this one, apparently there's a lion living next to a zebra. Okay, so the analogy, maybe it is already clear. So our aerosol particles are the water holes, right? And so the population is the ecosystem. And this goes back, developing these metrics goes back to the 1950s. And they fought many fights about what the best metrics should be and how to quantify this. But by now, they settled down, and we could take much of what they have developed and apply it to our problem. And so the way it works is it comes down to the mass fractions of species in particles, right? So that's that thing. And then by knowing the mass fractions of our species, which we know, right, because we track them, we can construct a thing what they call a mixing entropy. And if you look at this expression here, it's the Shannon entropy, right? So you take the ln of all your mass fractions, you multiply it by the mass fraction, and then you sum it over all species. That's how you get for each particle one of these numbers. And then to make the numbers nicer, you take the exponential of that number, and then you wind up with what is called the diversity of a particle. And just to illustrate this, it's pretty simple. So a particle that consists of a pure species has a diversity index of 1. Particle that consists of 2 species in the same amounts has index 2. And then if you have 3 species in equal amounts, this is index 3. If you have unequal amounts, you get fractions, right? This would be 1.4, 2.5, and so on. So you just need to know the mass fractions, which is indicated by the different colors. Then we can average those diversities for the entire population and come up with a index called the alpha diversity, or d alpha. So that was and that characterizes how complex the particles are on a per particle level on average. So now the second thing that we need is how different are the particles from each other, and that is why we define a bulk population diversity. And for that, we just throw all the species in one bucket for now. We forget about the different particles and calculate the diversity just analogously. So that's our second index called the gamma diversity. And then we can take the fraction, or the ratio of those two, and that is now our mixing state index, and we call that chi. And it varies, it's normalized, or that the 1 is subtracted, so it varies between 0, so that would mean I have a complete external mixture, to 1, which would mean I have a complete internal mixture. Okay, and then I can now graph all my populations in this nice 2-dimensional space. One dimension would be the per particle diversity, d alpha. In my system here, I only have 3 species, so the axis goes from 1 to 3. The higher I get on this axis, the more complex are the particles on a per particle level, right? And then on the y-axis is my gamma diversity, which tells me something about how many species I have in the bulk of this aerosol population. And then let's just go along this line, because this illustrates quite nicely what's going on. So along this line, the bulk diversity is 3, and it's constant, right? So this means we have the same amount of green, blue, and orange in our population as we go across, but the population changes in the way those bulk species are distributed over the population, right? So we go from a complete external mixture, so each particle is a single species, to a complete internal mixture where each particle contains all the 3 species to the same amounts, right? And so then the lines of constant chi are these diagonals here, so this would be chi equals 1, all particles are identical, and this is chi equals 0, all particles are different. And then with our particle-resolved model, we can now go through different exercises and look at the processes. So aerosol aging now is moving around this plane, right? So as we condense on our particles, we are moving in this direction. As we emit, we might move across those chi lines, and as we coagulate, we move across at constant d gamma to a higher d alpha value. So it's just to illustrate some what we call archetypal cases. The whole motivation why we really wanted to have such a metric is now that we can investigate the error when we neglect mixing state as a function of mixing state, right? And so now we have actually a metric for mixing state that we can graph our results against. And so what I haven't mentioned, I started out with explaining that our model is a box model. In the meantime, however, we have coupled that aerosol model to the WRF model. So some of you might be familiar with WRF Chem, right? So we took out the chem part and put our aerosol and chemistry code in. And so you can see this, it's a little bit covered up here, but this is a cross-section X and Y of a plume. So we are emitting a lot of, again, combustion aerosol right here. And so the wind is going this direction, so we get this nice plume. Any WRF Chem can do that too, right? But now we can drill deeper. So we can pick out a certain grid cell, and we know the mixing state, right? So we know we can look at these 2D distributions here, showing you black carbon mass fraction over size. We can go downstream and see how this changes as the particles age. And we can drill even deeper inside one of those distributions and look at individual particle constituents and also the sources. So we track when particles coagulate, what are the original, where are the constituent particles coming from. And for a plume like this, we can now calculate based on the particle composition those mixing state index and indices. And so we have the lowest mixing state index near the source, as you would expect, and it increases as you go downwind as the particles age, right? So you move to a more from an external mixture into a more internal mixture. But now we have numbers to put on this, right? And so this is now a model framework to evaluate the importance of mixing state. And so we can do exercises like this to see in our particle resolved reference case this distribution of critical supersaturation versus size might look like this, right? At a given size, we have this whole spread, similar to what I showed you before. If we now pretend, okay, we don't want to resolve all these differences here, that's due to composition, right? We can just average, and then you would get this. And then we can calculate CCN properties for this manipulated population. And if we do this for this one of these plumes that extends downwind, you can see that the errors in CCN concentration due to this averaging are high, as you might expect when the mixing state parameter is low. And when the mixing state parameter is high, which means you have a more internally mixed population, you have a very small error, right? So this is where a traditional model would do very well. Here, we have to pay more attention, right, if we have conditions like that. I want to finish this up with showing you some applications to field data. And so, as you if you remember how these mixing state indices are constructed, you obviously need the per particle mass fractions. So this is a very challenging thing to ask an experimentalist to give you. I found a brave soul, Robert Healy, at the time was at the University of Toronto, who developed a method how to tease out these mass fractions from his 8 of ms data. So with an 8 of ms instrument, you get these, for each particle you get mass specs like this, right? So you can tell, and normally they do a cluster analysis on these mass spectra to tell or to tease out what are the different types of particles that you find in a given environment. So they find maybe particles that are mainly black carbon, so these would be fresh combustion particles. This would be an aged particle, has a lot of nitrate, and this would be another aged particle that also has sulfate, not only nitrate. And Rob developed this method taking those mass specs in combination with other data, like an AMS for the compounds, and SNPS for size distribution, and an instrument that measures absorption. And he's now able to scale the peaks appropriately so that he can actually quantify the mass fractions of the species in each particle. And so we have 5 species in our system: organic carbon, black carbon, sulfate, nitrate, ammonium. So our diversity index should go from 1 to 5, right? And so he did this for, I forgot to mention this, for a field campaign in France, in Paris, during winter 2010, Megapoly. And so this is the average over the entire campaign. So now we see in color the number fraction as a function of size and the diversity index. So we see 2 subpopulations, right? So 1, these are the combustion particles. They are rather small and low diversity because they are dominated by black carbon, and compared to larger particles that contain a whole bunch of different compounds. So these are the aged particles that contain actually a lot of nitrate in this case. And so he did this for the entire campaign, which went from end of January to the mid-February. And so you can see how those mixing state metrics varied over the course of these few weeks. And they identified 2 different regimes. One that was more dominated by marine air masses. So what they saw at the site is more the local pollution that goes along with lower chi mixing state indices, indicating the fresh or representing the fresh emissions, versus periods where they had more continental airflow containing more aged pollution that goes, and that was more internally mixed now. And that's reflected by this higher mixing state index, and it's especially clear in this first part, maybe not so much in the second part. Yeah, so here the local sources dominate, and here we had aged aerosol from long-range transport. They also looked at an average diurnal cycle, again averaged over the entire domain. Now here shown in this d alpha, d gamma diagram. Remember, d alpha is how complex the particles themselves are on average, and d gamma is representative how complex the population composition is as a whole. And so they saw this characteristic cycle. The color now is the hour of the day. So during the night, we actually have aerosol aging because a lot of ammonium nitrate formed. That's much easier when it's cool, right? Because ammonium nitrate is very volatile. So we have formation during the nighttime. During the daytime, the emissions were injected and bringing down this, or moving us down in this diagram to lower diversity indices. Okay, so that brings me to my last slide. So what I wanted to show you was what are really particle resolved models and what can they be useful for. So in my view, it's a representative of a next generation detailed aerosol model that is synergistic with current measurement advances, right? So the measurements have become so sophisticated we can probe the aerosols on a per particle level. We have to keep up with the models too to make a or to complete the pictures. And so this type of model is useful when mixing state information needs to be resolved, or when we are wondering is it necessary to resolve mixing state information? And I showed you examples where we use it as a coarse graining tool. This goes all into this discussion, how do we actually use this model as part of the model hierarchy, right? Doing lots of simulations on a small scale, zooming out and learning something that can be useful for a larger scale. We can use it for benchmark and error quantification. And so for this, it was important to actually develop a metric, how to quantify error in this context. And the code is open source. You can download it from our website. And last, I would like to thank all my students. Some of them have moved on by now, have graduated. Many collaborators from UIUC and P&L, University of Toronto, and the funding agencies. Thank you.
All right, questions for Nicole?
Going back to your governing equations and something which I missed, my simple understanding is that with the aerosols, some of them are going to get out because of dry or wet deposition, but I didn't see that part in the equation.
Yeah, so that term is not in there.
How much does that affect the whole balance?
So, okay, so you are right. In reality, there is obviously dry and wet deposition. This is how particles are removed from the atmosphere. So for these simulations here, wait, oh, this way. I was basically showing an air parcel that is advected over this area, and it's just receiving. It's receiving pollution. We actually have in the model some removal due to dilution, so it's diluted out. But we certainly don't have wet deposition, so there is no rain right now. And in those simulations, we also didn't have any dry deposition. We can do dry deposition, and that would be an additional term in that governing equation, right? But actually, it's usually written as a boundary condition, right? Dry deposition. So that's why this is not included actually in this equation right here. But you're right; these are two other processes that don't appear.
I'm just curious about the verification. You showed that Paris example, so compared to your model, or what does it do?
Yeah, so that's a little bit of a problem because right now it's very hard to do validation with just a box model, right? Because the whole transport is missing and the dilution rate is very hard to estimate. So that's one of the reasons why we really wanted to implement it into a 3D model. So it's just like WRF-Chem, and we actually wanted to apply it to the CARES campaign in Sacramento, where we actually can compare two measurements at certain points, having the transport sort of hopefully right. So the comparison to field measurements is still something that we are working on. It's very hard to do with just a box model, right? Because there are so many unconstrained processes in this box model that you can tune your model like you want, and you may or may not get the right result, right? We have compared it to chamber data that I can show you later, just to look at the way coagulation is modeled. And that actually led to the interesting conclusion to replicate those measurements. We really had to take into account that the particles are not spherical, because in that barrel it was very dry, so they had dry ammonium sulfate agglomerates. And if we assume spherical particles, which we do normally, we didn't get a very good agreement. So that's one thing that is much easier to connect to this box model
So
how large the computational effort actually is? I'm just curious if I want to adapt that into say like a verification.
So the box model runs on my laptop. That's no problem at all. For this WRF, coupled to WRF, where we have many, many boxes, we just submitted a proposal to Blue Waters yesterday, where we request 300,000 CPU. So yeah, so we had an exploratory allocation where we scaled it up to 15,000 processors. Yeah, to do not very long run. Yeah.
It's a very interesting topic, and when you're talking about a different level of mixing on the particular level or individual level, maybe there's another level of mixing, like how the components are distributed within a
Yes.
particle.
Right.
And it might not be very important to the indirect aerosol effect lysis processes, but it might be important for the direct
Oh yeah.
effect. So I just wonder, is there any way to consider this information within the model?
How to store morphology? Is that what you mean?
What?
The question is how to, if the model is able to store and track morphology. Yeah. So, and that is really a very exciting topic, because you're right. For the optical properties, it matters tremendously what the shape is of that particle, right? And it's actually not that difficult to store morphology information. It's just one more entry in our vector, right? So right now we store the composition. We could easily store something like fractal dimension. In fact, for that chamber thing, we did exactly that. Or we could store things about what is on the surface versus inside. We could do that. One of the hampering issues is that, to my knowledge, we don't really know how these shapes are necessarily evolving over time, right? So, and that's really what we would like to do, not only to store or to assign static shapes, but these shapes evolve, right? And so how these fractal shapes collapse over time, or what we should do there, it's, we haven't worked in that direction yet. But I think that would be a really interesting direction to go into, and I think really important too for the optical properties in particular.